Back in the dark days of the 1970s, Labour infamously vowed to tax the rich until the pips squeak. Now it is doing the same in the name of wealth redistribution. In truth, this is simply state-sponsored robbery. These socialists don't respect private property and assume that the state can help itself to whatever it wants in the cause of redistributing wealth. That is exactly what their hero Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, and just look at the bankrupt basket case that country has sadly become. Meanwhile, as Labour plans to clobber aspirational, hard-working families, Tory leadership rivals are discussing economically literate ideas, such as abolishing stamp duty on homes worth less than £500,000 and increasing the national insurance contribution threshold. Such reforms really would help millions of people. Now, that's the editorial from yesterday's Daily Mail, and we can look at the front page. Labour's tax raid on family homes, just next to Kylie looking fabulous at Glastonbury, and Princess Diana, who against all odds is enjoying a new dawn. These articles, the bugbear of the Daily Mail, is here with me in the studio. So these articles were a reference to Labour's recent Land for the Many report, with recommendations about how to remedy wealth inequality and how to improve our management as a nation of land. One of the authors, Laurie McFarlane, is here. Economist, economics editor at Open Democracy, also work at UCL, am I right?
Yep.
And author of The Economics of Land and Housing.
Rethinking the Economics of Land.
Rethinking the Economic of Land and Housing. What have you done to get the Daily Mail so terrified?
Yeah, it's been really interesting actually, because I think the report came out over 4 weeks ago now, so it's not a new report in that sense. And we did anticipate when it was first published, given the kind of sensitivities around housing and land and the kind of emotional issue that it is that the tabloids play into, we did expect some kind of pushback to begin with. But what's been interesting is that in the kind of week, as the weeks have gone by, every couple of days has been another story and then another story, and it's kind of built up as if the kind of right-wing tabloids have just got a library of articles that they're just shoveling out, to the point where yesterday it culminated in the front page. And so, in one sense, it's not surprising. I think if you look at the proposals in the report taken as a whole, individually there's stuff in there that actually are probably, reasonably just kind of common sense, not that radical. But when you take it as a package overall, it is proposing quite a fundamental transformation in not just kind of housing provision or the method of housing delivery in this country, but more fundamentally about the kind of society and economy that we live in. And obviously to the kind of interest of the billionaire press, it's challenging. And so from that perspective, it's easy to see why they've gone for us. But also I think they've recognised that in this country, the politics around housing in particular and home ownership is very, very sensitive. And they know that. And they know it's a tricky area for Labour, because over the past 40 years, there's been remarkable consensus almost between Tories and Labour on housing policy. And this is a big departure that makes it very politically sensitive. And so they're very keen to use this as a stick to kind of beat Labour with, I think.
So what does it mean? So first things first, what does it mean that you've written a report for the Labour Party? Because I think what's sort of confusing in the newspapers is this Labour policy. You're not a policy writer of Labour Party policy, are you? They've invited you and George Monbiot and a bunch of academics to recommend how to deal with Britain's crisis when it comes to wealth inequality in land.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the background to this, it's maybe just worth dwelling on a little bit. So it was John Trickett, actually, who, in an initial discussion with George Monbiot, I think read George's book, which talks about some of these issues, was very kind of captivated by the issue of land. And in particular, I think John was thinking about the whole kind of issues around Brexit and how the stuff about take back controls really kind of captured politics. And he was thinking about, well, how can we kind of tap into that? And he very much believes, as we all do, that the issue of land is fundamental to the kind of disillusionment that people feel about the communities that they live in. And so one thing led to another, and George assembled a kind of crack team, I suppose, of 7 of us, who we all kind of co-authored this report. So it was an independent report commissioned by the Labour Party to inform their decision-making process. So there's been a series of other ones of these. The alternative models of ownership was one people might remember from a couple of years ago. I was also involved in another one earlier this year called Building a New Public Banking Ecosystem. So they're really to kind of inform the debate, to inform the policy-making process, rather than it's not official policy right now, although we very much hope, of course, that it will be in due course.
So we'll talk about, I suppose, a bunch of the proposals in the report throughout the show. Let's start with what the Daily Mail is so worried about here. Labour tax raid on family homes. What specifically are they talking about here?
So I think in that case, we're talking about inheritance tax reforms. So inheritance tax is obviously an important tax in some sense. It's one of the few taxes that we have on wealth, and there's widespread consensus that the way that it's constructed at the moment is very poorly designed. It's very easy to evade, and that means that we have lots of wealth transfer from one generation to the other. And what we propose is that it's replaced completely with a lifetime gifts tax, which means that any gifts received at any point in your life over the value of £125,000 will be taxed in that year. Rather than kind of waiting until you die, and then it's taxed, because obviously what people do is they just pass stuff over, years before, and then it doesn't get taxed. And this is an area, to be honest, where most of our tax proposals actually in the report are, there's pretty strong consensus. They're not that radical. The IPPR, Resolution Foundation, even I think the IFS, have all kind of looked at this or something similar, and agreed that it's sensible. So it's not really an area where we're kind of pushing the boat out really by any stretch of the imagination, but nonetheless it's something where the press have latched onto.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that will be running throughout the show, which is, especially in terms of that lifetime gift tax. I think the IPPR have also suggested the idea of all income should be taxed the same. So at the moment, you're taxed a different rate of income for work, which tends to be higher than the income you're taxed for capital gains, so the amount of money you get just from having wealth or investing it in the right places. And at the moment, I suppose you're taxed nothing for gifts.
Yeah.
So they're saying we should tax all income the same wherever it comes from. And as you're saying, I think there's within sort of like policy wonk circles, unless you're the Adam Smith Institute or the Institute of Economic Affairs or one of the sort of nut job right-wing ones. I do keep inviting them on the show, so I will call them nut job and they can have a right reply whenever they want it. But politicians are all terrified of this issue, right? So people in think tanks, wonks, and it's also in academia. So someone like Thomas Piketty is saying that we need to shift taxation to assets, to wealth instead of income, because wealth inequality is now a bigger issue than income inequality, and also that sort of people sitting on piles of assets is productively, or is non-productive, it's useless for the economy. So we need to shift the tax burden onto them or onto wealth. But people, I think the reason why it has so much purchase in the form of right-wing attacks is because people read it as expropriation. There's something about income where you don't quite have it yet. So the tax gets taken off at the end of the month if you're on PAYE, and then you get your income at the end after the tax is deducted. It doesn't come into your account and then go back out again. It does if you're self-employed. But do you think the Labour Party are going to run with this, or do you think they're going to see that when the public sort of have this emotional reaction to the idea of people or the state taking away their savings, or taking away parts of their savings, taking away parts of the money they're passing down to their children, do you think they'll recoil in the same way that previous governments have?
Well, I think that's the challenge really, because you're absolutely right. I think one of the interesting examples to look at is council tax. So council tax, everyone agrees across the spectrum that it's a really, really badly designed tax. So the council tax that you pay today is based on what the value of your property was in 1991. Not what it's valued today. And there's a reason why no political party or government has come out to update that. And that's because if you do that, it creates winners and losers overnight, and the losers tend to scream more loudly than the winners. And this kind of captures really, I think, some of the political difficulties in this whole area. Nonetheless, there are things that you can do. And I think that, having a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, bringing in a more radical approach to economic policy, I think they should be certainly setting out the ambition to take this on, because if they're not going to do it, then who will? And on this issue about salience, people don't like property taxes or things like that, because unlike other taxes, which are kind of invisible, so VAT, you don't even know you pay it because it just comes off every transaction, whereas council tax, you actually need to kind of like get your money and then pay a check. That's an important point, but I think we ought to be looking at ways of reducing the salience of it. So particularly now with, most taxation is digital now, of having tax come off your paycheck without having to go through that process, I think is something that should certainly be looked at to deal with these issues. Because although it seems kind of technical, it does make it does make a difference psychologically to the way that people look at these taxes. Another one, inheritance tax. I think it's only 7% of the population actually pay ever have to pay inheritance tax because of all the exemptions, and it's only over a certain amount of wealth. But nonetheless, it's one of the most unpopular taxes among the population, where you'd think it'd be quite popular because it's only taxing the rich people. But it's just the principle. People say, oh, but I want to be able to pass on wealth to my kids. This is wealth that I've earned, even though even though it's mainly because you've just bought a house and it's gone up in value. People deem it as kind of like unjust and unfair, and I think that's part of a result of the story around wealth creation and distribution that we've been told after 4 decades of neoliberalism, which is that people are just entitled to this wealth, that they've somehow earned it, even if in reality, of course, they haven't. They've kind of earned these massive windfall gains from simply owning land and property.
Have you thought about how to message the lifetime gift tax? So, I mean, you're going to replace the inheritance tax, right? So they can't call it a death tax anymore.
Yep.
But you've said there's a powerful story that's been told about how wealth is created. But I mean, the more powerful story really is about family, right? So it's about the idea that it's natural for parents to want to acquire something to pass on to their children. And it's sort of, I think why it has such an emotional reaction is because it seems like the state intervening in the relationship between parent and child as much as sort of like the state intervening in property rights. I don't know how you think you're going to message, or how the Labour Party, if they were to take on this policy, would message that. Would message the importance and the necessity and the morality of a gift tax.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I mean, I think partly it's got to be around making it clear that most people won't be affected by this. So even under our proposals, you have £125,000 worth of wealth, of gifts that can be transferred within your lifetime that you pay zero tax on. So for most people, £125,000 of wealth is somewhere that they'll probably never get to. So we really only are talking about tapping into that vast pools of wealth that have been accumulated by a relatively small number of people.
So you think go for the class war line?
Yeah, but I do, but I should caveat that heavily, actually, because one of the areas why this whole area of landed housing is so difficult for Labour in particular, but just generally, is that Labour's narrative on the economy generally under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell has been, for the many, not the few, saying actually on income tax, or, only the top 5% of earners are going to pay more, all the rest of it. The tricky thing is with this area is that in terms of the status quo, it's not just the top 5% of people who are doing well out of this. It's actually large parts of the population who are homeowners, so at the moment about 63%. And obviously when you live in a society where the majority of people own their home and you live in a democracy, that creates this kind of almost tyranny of the majority whereby politicians pander to homeowners who also turn out to vote more than people who don't own the property at the expense of people who don't own property. And so it is very, very tricky because when we're talking about a system which rewards property ownership so much, you're actually talking about not just the elites here, but actually large swathes of the population who you're kind of you're kind of relying on to win a general election. So that's what makes this particularly tricky versus other areas, I think. And
do you think you've in any way resolved that? Because that was the genius, right, of Thatcher selling off the council housing and the idea of making a property owning democracy, which is that if you increase the number of property owners in a society, you increase the number of people who are invested in a speculative economy and the idea where your income comes from your assets because so many people have assets. So any attempt to rebalance the economy hits so many people that, well, anyone up to basically Corbyn and McDonnell have seen it as something that's completely untouchable beyond sort of like the mansion tax, so the idea of creaming off the very top of asset ownerships, but not really challenging the productive model, as it were. You want to take on home ownership as a key part of Britain's economic model without pissing off 63% of the population.
Yeah.
How do you... It's a challenge.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And I mean, I think that's why you're right. I mean, Thatcher's right to buy, for me, is like a huge inspiration in many senses, because what the Tories always got, I think, more than Labour even, is that the property relations of the domestic environment have a huge impact, not just on housing provision, but on fundamentally the kind of ideological outlook of the population. And right to buy kind of shattered collective solidarity, socialist sentiment in communities and replace that with a sense of individualism, private property, unearned wealth, etc. And created this intentional system of giving people a stake in this system, which means that they're more likely to vote for the Tories. I do think now, though, that whole model, which, by the way, was also backed by Labour and still is to some extent, is now becoming untenable because it's starting to eat itself in the sense that we did see a huge increase in home ownership, dramatic increase in home ownership, right up the way through until the late 1990s. But as a result of the policies that were introduced to promote home ownership, which we talk about in the report, hugely incentivizing home ownership versus renting, liberalisation of the financial sector, all the rest of it, the result of that was a huge escalation in house prices versus the incomes. And we've reached now the point where house prices have become so detached from incomes that a whole generation's priced out, and home ownership's now been falling dramatically since the early 2000s. Mortgage home ownership's actually been falling since the late 1990s. And this is a pattern we see in other Anglo-Saxon economies who followed a similar model, places like Canada, Australia. And so we're at the point now where it's going into reverse. And I think we will reach a tipping point. And we've already reached it in London, because I think it was just last year for the first time, renters overtook owners, which is a significant turning point, I think, in the terms of political economy of this debate. And if you couple the disillusioned renters, people stuck in that with no prospect of home ownership, combined with, I think, worried parents, for example, who see that there's something wrong here because the kids don't have the opportunities they do, I think there is a coalition now that can be built across society that is willing to contemplate changes that perhaps 10 years ago even, and even before that, they wouldn't be willing to contemplate. And I think that's the task, really, is to build that coalition and to sell the arguments to the population in order to win these arguments in a general election.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, and I think that's one of the reasons why the report can be seen as quite significant. So, and also why you have a sort of real challenge ahead of you. So, one of the challenges we've talked about is the idea that people have a real moral attachment to their wealth, and especially passing on their wealth. Or people have a moral attachment to gifts, actually. I think there's a whole anthropological literature about this that I haven't read, but the idea that sort of like gifts are something which is somewhat sacred, I think is something that people have in their heads. So that's a challenge, how you persuade people this is a good idea. The opportunity, really, I think, is you're right that Maggie Thatcher, in selling off the council homes and in sort of like a system of financialisation where people's houses were assets which were rising in prices and made people feel richer and genuinely made people richer, it was very hard to challenge that model when the majority of the population were benefiting from it, as it were, even if it was screwing over people who were still renting. Now, and that was an election-winning machine, both for the Tory party and then, it wasn't so much an election-winning machine for the Labour Party, but it meant that the Labour Party could only get re-elected if it reassured people that it wasn't going to mess about with that neoliberal speculative model. That system's now eaten itself, and it's eaten itself because not enough people either are on the property ladder or see themselves as in the near future being on the property ladder. As it were, the drawbridge has been pulled up. And now there is an opportunity, if Labour get into government, to completely refashion the interests involved in housing. And I want to know how you think we can do a reverse Maggie Thatcher. So there's a crisis moment. We have an opportunity to refashion how housing happens. How, when we fix that, do we create a bunch of social democrats who, because of their tenure, because of the way they live, because of whether they rent or own or whatever, they have an interest in social democracy as opposed to neoliberal, speculative financial economies? How are you going to social engineer the population now you have the opportunity to?
Yeah, good question. I think that there's a number of things that that can be done. So I kind of tackled this this kind of question really in a recent Jacobin piece, which is really thinking about what can we learn from Thatcher's right to buy in terms of the left, in terms of how we kind of go about decommodifying housing. And I think there are really, three or four kind of key lessons from that. And the first is that stories and narratives do matter, I think, quite a lot. So, right to buy wasn't pursued in isolation. It was bound up in a much wider project of, Thatcher's economic vision, the story about how, entrepreneurship and freedom and wealth creation, etc. And I do think there's a task there that Labour have started to do to kind of challenge that. But certainly when it comes to housing, it was interesting in that Daily Mail article you read at the beginning, which kind of castigated Labour's talk of wealth redistribution and saying this is robbery. Whereas actually I think that the housing market the past 4 decades has been the kind of largest transfer of wealth I think we've seen in living memory, because all of the wealth that's been accumulated, the trillions of pounds in the property market, has really come at the expense. It's come straight out of the pocket of those who don't own property. And I think kind of communicating this whole this message about how actually wealth's created and distributed, where value comes from, is a big thing that Labour need to work on and do more on. The second thing I think, though, which is interesting, is this idea that local experiments do matter quite a bit. And this is, historically we see lots of the kind of most transformational policies that this country's ever seen started, at least were seeded as local experiments, which are then proved that they were feasible and then got scaled up. So the NHS is one example, but Right to Buy is another example. That was actually started off. The Tory leadership.
Did the NHS start small? I always assumed that was a sort of like big bang.
Well, it took inspiration from, I think it was in Wales, kind of local public healthcare that was kind of used as a kind of inspiration for rolling out the NHS. And Right to Buy was similar. So I think what is really important when we talk in the report about community-led schemes and also the kind of municipal socialism agenda generally of like demonstrating at a local level that things like this do really work quite well. And I also think that it needs to be bound up in a much wider debate around the kind of financialized nature of our economy more generally. That you mentioned already, Right to Buy was hugely impactful on its own, but what made it really powerful was the combination of that with liberalising the financial sector at the same time, which really kind of put the property market on steroids. The final thing, which I think is the most important one, particularly in the context that we're in British politics today, is that the language of control is really, really, really important, particularly when it comes to housing. So one of the ways that Right to Buy was sold to the public was around this idea that, in council housing, you don't have control over where you live. It's a very individualized sense of control. You can't decorate your door or whatever. And that by getting the dream of owning your own home, you can kind of get around that. And that was sold very powerfully to people. Today, I think there is this sense of lack of control of people's lives, but I think it's a different type of lack of control. It's a sense of people not having control over what's happening in their area. There's gentrification, there's luxury flats being put up, there's local communities getting priced out of the market, and the sense that the world's changing around them and they can't do anything about it. And this is where I think this agenda can really tap into that by introducing the kind of legislative means, the resources required, all the rest of it, to actually empower local communities to take control, if you like, of their local communities and assets, in a way, empower them to do that in a collective way, and kind of capture that spirit of collective spirit, collective solidarity over the local area, and move away from that hyper-individualized way. So yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult, and there's no silver bullet, there's no short-term fix. This is a long-term project, but I think we can see some of the seeds in this report that can hopefully kind of kickstart the process.
I mean, as obviously this isn't Labour Party policy at this point, but as an author of the report, right? How do you feel about private ownership of homes? Are you biased towards like people renting or home ownership? So I mean, one opposition to Right to Buy could be the fact that it makes people into property owners, which is, inherently to some extent morally degrading, and that makes you an individualist, and that it's better to have property in common and that you rent it off the state, etc., etc. The other is a more pragmatic one, which was that it was combined with a project to unleash the financial sector, which meant we had a speculative economy, which is less productive, and also they blocked councils from reinvesting that money in new homes. So I suppose another way of putting the question, if Maggie Thatcher hadn't unleashed the financial sector and hadn't blocked local councils from reinvesting the money they made from Right to Buy, would Right to Buy have actually been a neutral policy or potentially a positive one? It was popular.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there were lots of other things that were done as well. That besides the kind of liberalisation of the financial sector, making home ownership very tax attractive, completely withdrawing from the provision from the state's role in providing housing and relying on the private sector, etc. So there's a whole other bunch of things tied up in the Thatcher project, which bound it up. I mean, personally, I think that there is certainly something in a kind of decommodifying housing, and there is an argument. Some people say actually,
what does decommodifying mean?
Well, taking it out of the whims of the market, if you like. So providing, I mean, social housing, council housing is one example of decommodifying. Yeah. There are also kind of community models of decommodifying housing, community land trusts, etc., where they're in an asset lock, and nobody can make money out of it. Effectively, is what it's about. And I think we definitely ought to be moving in the direction of travel towards greater decommodification of housing. Now, there's an interesting discussion, though, about what that means at the level of individual home. And one of the boldest measures in this report is something called the Common Ground Trust. And this is the kind of brainchild of one of the co-authors, Beth Stratford, which is fundamentally about separating the ownership of the bricks and mortar from the land that sits underneath. Because when it comes to the kind of speculative characteristics of the housing market, it very much is the land that's underneath the house that is at the heart of that, rather than the bricks and mortar. And so what the Common Ground Trust does is basically gradually socializes the land though is underneath the bricks and mortar, so people can still get the sense of ownership of a house, if you know what I mean. But they don't own the land that sits beneath it, and instead they pay a ground rent to the state. And this is something actually that there's been lots of different kind of variations of this or proposals of this throughout history. But I was in Amsterdam just the other week speaking at a festival, and in Amsterdam, most of the land, 8% of it's publicly owned.
80?
Yeah, they have a land lease system in Amsterdam, which is precisely that model, which is they own the bricks and mortar and you pay a ground rent to the state. In Singapore, often held up as this kind of free market paradise, the state owns 90% of the land. And so I think as a model of how do we kind of socialize land rents and capture that for the common good, if you like, is certainly one we should be moving towards. And then beyond that, there's a discussion around, okay, well, what about the bricks and mortar? And to be honest, I think there's no one size fits all. Some people will want to, like the idea of owning their own house. Some people like the idea of living in a community scheme. I think we absolutely need to be building much more public housing as well. And so having a range of different tenure options for people that suit different needs, that suit different circumstances is essential. But fundamentally at the heart of it is the principle that houses should be, moving towards a world where houses are places to live, not vehicles for accumulating wealth.
I mean, the Common Ground Trust was my favourite bit of the report. So, I'm a class-wide social democrat. I don't think we should abolish private property, and I think that you get some efficiency gains from having competition in commodity markets, etc., etc. But I don't see any efficiency gain whatsoever in private property of land. It seems bonkers. Yeah. I mean, even people like Adam Smith did Adam Smith he didn't want to nationalise the land, did he? But he did think that land rent was not efficient.
I mean, all the you go back classical political economy. I mean, Karl Marx, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, they all agreed that having a system where there's vast windfall gains to be made from land is undesirable, and they disagreed. I mean, Marx obviously wanted the nationalisation of land. The classical liberal economists, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, etc., proposed taxing land, significant taxes on land, so that that was captured for the kind of public benefit rather than going into private hands. It was kind of widely accepted, actually, back across the spectrum, that having a system whereby there are significant landowners are able to extract wealth from other people is not desirable.
Economically pointless. It's a drag on the system, isn't it?
It's a drag on the system. So even from a capitalist point of view, if your aim is to have a kind of dynamic, productive capitalism, which obviously isn't the aim of our report, but even from that perspective, it's not efficient. From our perspective, having all of this kind of land hoover up all of this wealth and resources, that's redirecting from being allocated towards far more socially useful purposes. And so that's one of the key aims of the report, is to gradually transform our economy, move it away, wean it off our addiction on land and property prices, and redirect our kind of investment, redirect our savings towards things that are more socially useful.
I mean, it's the easiest. I think Labour should shout about this more, actually, because I find it the easiest argument to make on the doorstep. I mean, I haven't been canvassing that much since 2017, for example. But in 2017, I did it a lot. And you have people who are sort of, even small business owners, who are sort of worried about higher taxation or state intervention in the economy. And often I was a bit like, I don't actually know what Labour's tax policy is with regard to small businesses. I haven't looked up the details. I think presumably it sounds like they're going to tax the big ones. But listen to this argument, So imagine if you've got a small business in Hackney, and the reason that there's not that much money spent, hiring whatever your services are, is that most people who live in Hackney are spending 50% of their income paying rent to someone who's doing absolutely nothing, who's sitting on their ass in the home counties, and who most of that money, or a large proportion of it, either goes to the mortgage, which goes to some other lazy bastard sitting somewhere else, or it goes into their savings account, which they don't really spend, because rich people spend less of their money than poor people. And so imagine how productive your small business in Hackney is going to be if everyone is suddenly paying half the amount of rent. That frees up another 300 quid they're going to go spend in your CAF, and then that's going to, it's quite easy to explain what's it called in economics? The multiplier effect.
Yeah.
When you put a bit of money in the hands of a poor person, they spend it, and then that creates employment, and it goes round and round and round. It's quite an easy argument to make, I think, and I think Labour should make it more. In terms of how you practically sort of socialise land and stop this drain on the economy, again, so your practical proposal for doing that is the Common Ground Trust, right? I think, primarily.
So that's a kind of key, one key proposal that aims to do that, but that's in terms of ownership. But lots of the other proposals around sort of the reform of taxation, around macroprudential policy and preventing...
So you've got taxing it as well, right?
Yeah, so we've got various forms of taxing it, and also preventing this,
speculative
process by reining in finance as well, in order to kind of slow this boom down.
let's go on that. I want to talk about that in a sec, because I think there's issues with if you want to slow the speed of house price growth. How do you stop a massive recession? Because if house prices drop sort of rapidly, that can cause economic problems. But first of all, on this Common Ground Trust, I think something that was interesting reading the report is that on the one hand, you say that about 70% of the value of homes is in the land. Is that correct?
On average across the UK.
On average across the UK.
So it varies dramatically across the country.
And it might be even higher in London, right?
Yeah, it will be, definitely.
So it might be 80%, 85% or something. And what you're going to propose is that if a home buyer doesn't really care about the speculative value of the home and doesn't want to own the land, they can ask this trust to buy the land and they'll pay a land rent to them. I mean, if this all happens, presumably, I could buy a house for 50 grand or something, because I'd only be paying 10% of the price now. So everyone could own a home.
I mean, yeah. So the idea is that you would put down, you would only have to pay for the bricks and mortar itself, and that the trust would take into ownership the land, and you would then have an ongoing liability indefinitely, which would be paying a land rent into the Common Ground Trust.
And how much would that be?
Oh, I mean, it depends.
I mean,
on where
you can't
you
set the price. I mean, what are we talking here? Because this also sounds incredibly expensive for the state, right? If everyone who wants to buy a house can ask the state to purchase the land, and if the land is 80% of the property value in London, that means that anyone who wants to buy a house, the state has got to front up 450k.
Yeah, but bearing in mind as well that they also get a set of future revenue streams off the back of that. So this is the same kind of false argument you hear about, nationalisation costing tons of money. Actually, from a kind of basic accounting perspective, it doesn't. It's because you're paying up front in exchange for a flow of future revenue streams. So yeah, there will be upfront cash commitments that need to be made through the Common Ground Trust, and that's the same. If we're talking seriously about re-empowering the public sphere, taking back things into collective ownership and control, that's going to be the case across the board, and this is just one example of that. I think it's the same with building council housing.
Do you think that could happen, the Common Ground Trust? I'm just excited. It's the first time I thought maybe I could own a home.
Do you think? Yeah, I mean, certainly that's one of the benefits of it, is certainly bringing into, there are loads of people out there who at the moment it's just not possible at all, and this provides a means for people like that to to get a place called their own without having to kind of either have very, very rich parents, which is basically the case now. The Bank of Mum and Dad, I think, is now the 9th biggest mortgage lender in the country, bigger than like Yorkshire Building Society. So if you're not in that position, particularly if you're in London and the South East, you've just got no chance at all. And so this is one area where I think, in terms of making it politically attractive, I think you're right. This is an area that get the messaging right could be potentially attractive.
All right, we're going to talk in a moment about how to, I suppose, temper the housing price or the housing market bubble or speculative economy without making it crash. First of all, you're watching Novara Media, you're watching Tysky Sour. This is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a donor to Novara Media, thank you very much. You're what makes this possible. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com. Our ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or if you're a landlord, I think 95% of your rental income per month, unless more than 5% you have to pay in tax. I don't know. Do landlords currently get taxed?
Not enough.
Anyway, pay your taxes first, and of the disposable income that's left, pay 95% to us. As ever, we want more people to watch this show, so share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook. Please like it on YouTube. It means it appears in more people's feeds. And keep your comments coming. I'll be putting your questions to Laurie at the end of the show. All right, let's talk about how to dampen the housing market without causing an economic crash. One part of the report is how to make, as I read it, how to make buy-to-let quite unattractive. Because at the moment, people can, if you're savvy enough, all you have to do is get a mortgage on a property, you rent it out to someone, they pay off your mortgage, essentially. This renter pays off your mortgage, essentially, and then after 20 years, you get to keep a house and the renter has to fuck off and do whatever they want.
Yeah.
You're saying that's a stupid drain on the economy. It's not particularly fair. And so the Labour Party are going to introduce a bunch of measures to make that unattractive. At the same time, what the Labour Party want to do is make it unattractive to buy a house for speculative purposes. So if you're a Russian oligarch and you want to put your money somewhere where you think it's going to achieve a decent return, instead of putting it into British Steel, which seems on its last legs, you put it into British Mansions, which gaining 5% per year. Again, you want to stop that because you think that's a drain on the economy. That's pointless. It's not creating any jobs. It's just, I suppose, increasing people's rents or worsening the housing shortage. How do you disincentivize buy-to-let owners, disincentivize Russian oligarchs without crashing the economy. Because if we have a situation where house prices plummet, you end up with a lot of people with negative equity. That means they have a mortgage for a house that was worth £500,000 that's now worth, £250,000, and suddenly they're looking like they're bankrupt.
Yeah, so this is the kind of $1 million question, which is the easy bit of this whole debate is kind of like working at what needs to be done, where you want to get to. The tricky bit is how do you get there in a way which doesn't crash the economy? Because bearing in mind, it's not just all the things you said are true, but it's not just that. It's the fact that our entire banking system, domestic banking system, balance sheets are secured against the residential land values in this country. And so if
it's not just homeowners with mortgages who get screwed over, it's the whole banking system that collapses.
System. Exactly, and politicians are not going to want to contemplate another crash in the banking system and all the rest of it. So this is the kind of the key question, really. And we recognise, so a lot of the proposals in the report, you mentioned buy-to-let, also the tax reforms, the financial sector reforms, absolutely will, let's say, dampen the market than it would otherwise have been. And I should also say that one of the key proposals in the report, which many of these things contribute to, is an explicit aim to stabilise nominal house prices. So that's the aim that we recommend Labour should get to.
Not lower them, stabilise them.
To stabilise nominal house prices. So what that would mean is that over time it would give wages a chance to catch up and inflation an opportunity to kind of eat away at the real value of the property.
So house prices real values of house prices would be falling.
Yeah.
So if it's worth £500,000 now, you want it to be worth £500,000 in current prices.
Yeah. So
in a decade's time.
It's to stabilise prices in pounds. That's the kind of aim that we think, because what we definitely want to avoid is having a kind of a sudden overnight correction. Partly because the way that our economy's evolved to be so intertwined with the property market. Basically, when house prices are going up, the economy is doing well, and when they're going down, the economy suffers. And if you trigger a recession, it's typically those who can afford it least to suffer the most, all the rest of it. And politically, it's obviously a nightmare as well. So we want to avoid that. And so there's a number of things that we recommend in this vein. Some of it's about phasing in, make sure that policies are phased in rather than everything's increased on kind of day one overnight, trigger a big crash. Another thing, though, is important part is coming back to the Common Ground Trust, because one of the functions of the Common Ground Trust, which is why it's potentially particularly clever, is one of the functions it can serve is to replace the demand that will be lost when things like buy-to-let becomes unattractive. Because if all of a sudden buy-to-let just isn't as profitable as it was, what you always hear from people in that industry, they say it'll be a massive sell-off, it'll crash the market. And you go, okay, maybe people will sell off, but you have the Common Ground Trust come in and give people like you the opportunity to snap up these properties.
50k.
And the Common Ground Trust comes in and buys the land underneath it. It provides a way to kind of cushion that and actually have a transition away from having speculative landlords owning this and giving ordinary people who are otherwise locked out a way to step in. And that provides that kind of demand, that cushion demand, to kind of, it's almost like a stabilizing effect in the market. And that's the second kind of key function of the Common Ground Trust that potentially plays an important role. But the phasing thing is really important as well. I mean, we wouldn't recommend sort of coming in and just sort of like hitting the nuclear button and trying to do it all at once and generating some kind of crash, because that's not really in anyone's interest.
I mean, the phasing in bit as well also seems like a massive challenge to me, right? So I think in the section on increasing the rights of renters, you talk about the need to have open-ended tenancies, so it's much harder for a landlord to kick out their tenants if, for example, they just want to sell the house. So at the moment, the landlord can say, I want to sell the house, you have to leave. You know, that's a good enough reason. You want to say that's no longer going to be a good enough reason. And one of the reasons that has to come in is because if you suddenly make becoming a buy-to-let landlord unattractive, you don't want all the landlords to sell up at the same time and suddenly you create a bunch of homeless private renters. Because even though, you know, in the medium term, they might be able to buy a house off the back of this common ground trust, that's what it's called. In the short term, that might be difficult. So you're going to phase it in, do this first, and then make buy-to-let landlording, is that the word? Being a buy-to-let landlord unattractive. But this isn't a secret. You've written the report, you know. So if you're an astute buy-to-let landlord, a Labour government comes in, you can read this policy document and say, fuck, they're going to really squeeze me in a year's time or 2 years' time or 3 years' time. Let's sell up now. So how do you deal with that? The idea that landlords have foresight. if I were if I were an astute, forward-thinking landlord, Labour comes into power, or a forward-thinking oligarch, Labour comes into power, should I not just try and sell up my property as quick as fucking possible? And isn't that going to cause a crash?
Well, I mean, and this kind of debate and issues. It's not just this is relevant to all of Labour's agenda in some senses because you have lots of people saying various wealth advisors and all the rest of it. Like you need to act quickly. In this case, though, I mean, again, we should emphasise it's not Labour policy yet, and I suspect that if Labour were clever about the way that they were introducing this stuff, they would announce things sufficiently in advance. They would give a clear kind of phasing in of things so that it's not just it might be the case that in you're being how profitable it would be to be a landowner would kind of or landlord would kind of probably, as various things were introduced over time, gradually decrease. And actually, I mean, there's been various reforms already on the buy-to-let market that it's already not actually as profitable as it was. George Osborne, actually, for all his flaws, one of the only good things that he did was increase tax on it reduced the mortgage interest relief that landlords buy-to-let landlords have, which they've moaned about a lot since that happened. And so and there's also been changes to taxation as well. And so I think we want to see the kind of gradual phasing out of buy-to-let landlordism. And we should also remember, I mean, this is something that is totally, I mean, I was in Sweden a few months ago. It just doesn't exist there. Like, it's just not a thing.
There aren't buy-to-let landlords in
Sweden. There aren't just like individual buy-to-let landlords. I mean, there is private rented market, but the housing is owned by
big institutions,
organizations, and all the rents are negotiated collectively by a trade union. The idea that there's like individual rogue landlords going about and people on their own who can get kicked out within 6 months is just like alien, and that's true on most of the continent. It's just I mean, England in particular is like off the chart in terms of tenant rights. It's just not a normal thing, and so yeah, of course, buy-to-let landlords are going to squeal about this. But at the end of the day, the market has actually only existed since the 1990s. It didn't exist before then either. It was kind of created in this country, and I think it's time's up really. And I think we do need to make it clear that they probably should exit the market, but do so in an orderly manner.
What were New Labour thinking? So in terms of, it feels like everyone now admits housing is a fuck up. You've created this really illogical system whereby people who are working, hard-working families have to pay 50% of their income to some lazy fucker who's not doing anything. You're sitting on land, it's completely unproductive. The buy-to-let system seems completely mad, just because of how sort of like unequal its impacts are. What do you have any insight into? I mean, we had 13 years of Labour government during the biggest boom in house prices in Britain. Was there any way they could justify what they were doing, or did they just leave their foot off the wheel? Was it the foot off the?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm sure there's a quote from Gordon Brown, which says something like, sometime in the early 2000s, I will not let house prices, under my watch, house prices will not continue increasing out of control or something like that. And that literally just came before what was literally the biggest boom. I think 2003, nearly 20% of people earned more from their house price increase than they did from work. Crazy stuff. To be honest, I mean, I don't have any insight to it, but I suspect that that it was kind of serving them well, in the sense that you did have, for the kind of middle classes, if you like, of society and upwards, were doing pretty well out of it. And this is around the whole time, remember, that actually Labour's kind of core working class constituency was kind of abandoning the party. They weren't members, they were kind of leaving them anyway. They weren't turning out to vote anyway, and so
they were worried about Mondeo Man. The swing voter was someone who owned a home,
exactly, or wanted to own a home. So they were very much focused on that, and so it wasn't so much of an issue. And of course, the crisis wasn't quite as acute as I think it is now. It's just got worse and worse and worse, to the point now where I think everyone's kind of realizing, right, something's really got to change, because something's really not right. And I think that's only really started to happen probably in the last, since the financial crisis, certainly.
I'm going to start taking your questions in a moment, but so start typing those now, and I'll collect them whilst you are typing. So we talked earlier about the way that sort of the Thatcherite policy of creating a property owning democracy to make a somewhat right-wing electorate was incredibly successful for a period of 3 or 4 decades, but it's now eating itself because not enough people can get on the housing market. Presumably, I mean, there's there's a Labour Party strategy, which is how to use this crisis to win an election and then refashion the economy. Presumably, there's a similar conversation going on in Tory party circles for Tory strategists of how to rescue this system. I'm sure they're worried about the fact that you have a younger generation who's more left-wing than ever for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons is they can't get on the housing ladder, which was always supposed to be the conveyor belt which makes people right-wing, and that stopped working. Do you have any insight into what the right-wing fix would be to this crisis? Is there one, or are they screwed?
So I think there's two things. So one of them is actually it's not just limited to the right. It's actually still limited, I think, to parts of Labour, centre parts of Labour.
Who want to keep this system going?
Who want to keep the system going, which is basically the kind of property owned democracy dream is the right one. What government needs to do is just continue with new ways to help people to do that, to sort of stimulate, demand side things.
Help to buy,
all this kind of stuff. So they think that they can keep this show on the road. Now we're seeing, banks as well innovating in terms of, giving 100% mortgages if your parents can kind of underwrite it and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that's a dead path, to be honest. I think that all of the ways that they've kind of tried to prop this up have kind of run out of steam. So I don't think that's credible. But I think there are people who are trying to cling on to this big time. The second thing, the only kind of, people who are kind of thinking about this on the right is the free market right type approach, which they like to pin all of these issues, surprise, surprise, on red tape in the planning system, on regulation and all the rest of it, and that we should just liberalise the planning system, do away with the green belt. One of their favourites in the free market think tanks is doing away with height restrictions, and just have it, let them rise, if you know what I mean.
I'm quite into high rise, to be honest.
Which kind of misdiagnoses the kind of symptom, though. And one of the things
I'm just into it because I don't like walking so far to see my friends. So I lived in Madrid for a year, and people live like on top of each other, and it means that within a 1 or 2 mile radius you can visit most of the people whereas in London, because we're so spread out, it takes an hour to see your friend on the other side of the city. So I would say build up for pragmatic reasons, but anyway, that's somewhat besides the point.
As long as the lifts don't break. But yeah, so there's this kind of super supply side approach which diagnoses the problems that we've seen as there's been purely as a lack of supply. One of the things we're very, very clear on in the report is that the problems that we've seen in our housing market, and particularly the housing affordability issues, are not primarily because we haven't built enough homes. That's not the actual reason that's going on here. It's all these other things. That doesn't mean that we don't need to build more homes. We definitely do. We definitely need to build more actually affordable homes, not affordable homes, but actually affordable homes. But that's certainly where I think a lot of the intellectual energy is around on the right at the moment, is around how do we kind of deregulate, how do we kind of, particularly around planning, can we not just bulldoze the green belt, or can we not just build up and stuff like that, as if that's going to, another dose of deregulation, if you know what I mean, is kind of the answer I think they're looking at.
I mean, I suppose that question of supply is an interesting one, because it does seem somewhat intuitive that the idea that the reason house prices are so high is because there aren't enough of them, and demand has outstripped supply. And I could see potentially a fix for the Conservative parties if they just build 4 million houses and create 4 million new homeowners, or 4 million new households who are homeowners and who are tied into a speculative economy that can continue in the same way that it has because it's electorally popular. If that can't happen, why can't that happen?
Well, so firstly, if the fundamental problem is that house prices relative to incomes have become detached to a point which is unsustainable, if your answer to that is we're going to build more homes, you would need to build a ludicrous amount of homes to even make a dent in that house price to income ratio. So even the government's own model that it uses for housing internally in the Department for local government, or whatever it is these days, local government and communities, it says itself that even if since 1996 the government had built an extra 300,000 houses every single year, which is obviously a huge amount of houses, house prices would only be 7% lower than they are today. So fundamentally, you can build lots and lots of houses. You aren't necessarily going to make a dent, or a significant dent, in the huge affordability issues that we've seen. Obviously, that will vary depending on where you are in the country, and I think there is certainly a need in parts of the country for significant house building programs. But that isn't going to get away from the fundamental problems that we've seen, which is because we've got a heavily financialised property market where housing is very, very attractive as a financial asset, and we've incentivized this whole system. As long as that continues, you can build more houses all you like, but it's not going to fundamentally solve that. It's not going to solve that fundamental issue. And so I think it's important that while we do need to build more houses, we challenge the idea that this is somehow a cure-all solution to the problems.
This is a good question. I don't know the answer. It's interesting. Matthew Shearing, how does buying the land under the property work for high-rises, flats, etc.? Do you buy it for all of them at once or a percentage share of that land each time? I'm also going to add my own bit, which is that it's very easy to understand how in a house, when you buy a house, you're also buying the value of the land, and that's why it's so expensive. When you buy a flat, you're not buying the value of the land, yet it's still incredibly expensive.
So you are kind of buying the value of the land, because what you're really, I mean, the value of land really reflects the locational value. So the land is valuable because of what's around it. So obviously, you have an empty field over there, it's not worth very much, there's nothing there. If you have a railway station built there, you have houses built there, you have shops built there, you have employers built there, the land becomes valuable. So when you buy a flat, which is situated ultimately in a site location, that's partly reflected, that the value of that flat reflects the site value of that plot, which is the land that sits underneath. As in terms of the Common Ground Trust, it's a good question. I mean, various ways you can do it. You can have basically apportioned kind of effectively proportionately to however much your flat takes up of the block, and then pay the ground rent in proportion to that. But yeah, I mean, these are the kind of details that are important, that need to be fleshed out.
This is a nice provocative question from Ihasa. Might be a stupid question, but why? They're our favourites, so keep them coming. But why do we care about collapsing the economy? Can't we just nationalise everything by force?
Yeah, good question. I mean, why do we care about collapsing the economy? First thing, as I said before, because history tells us that when you do have significant economic crises, it is not the wealthy and powerful who suffer from that. For the most part, is often working people who can afford at least. And so we, and also purely from a purely narrow electoral point of view, if you're Labour and you come in, the last thing you want to be doing is crashing the economy on purpose, because it's not going to do your re-election. It's not going to do your re-election chances any good. Can't you just nationalise everything in response? You give it a try. I think Labour are already going to have an interesting challenge on their hands when they come into power. Battling various kinds of special interests and forces. That I think we want to do everything we can to make that easier rather than more difficult when they come into power.
This is a good question. This is an interesting one. Rune Butt asks, is private property ownership completely opposed by Marxism, even if there is one home per family? Quite a wonky question. You might not know the answer to that, unless you're a Marx expert.
Is what, sorry?
Is private property ownership completely opposed by Marxism, even if there is one home per family? So how did this work in communist societies? How did it work in the Soviet Union? Was everyone a renter in a big institutional block, or did people own their own homes?
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's these, what are they called? There's large. I mean, I think it was Owen Hathaway did a really interesting piece kind of on kind of Soviet housing and architecture recently. Yeah, I mean, I think it was collective housing in kind of often big blocks and things like that. I mean, on the question of Marxism, I mean, in communism, I guess nobody's really opposed to personal property and people having their own things and things like that. What it's really about is not having private ownership of the means of production. I think that when it comes to the domestic environment and things like that, you need to get you can ask David Harvey or something like that next time you have on him about this, but I would suspect that communism would favour collective forms of housing rather than private ones, but that's one for the Marx scholars, I think.
I'm reading a book by Esping Anderson at the moment, which is about how social policy forms a social democratic community or undermines it, and he looks at Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It's from a while ago, so he's looking at it in the 70s and 80s. In Denmark, they have a speculative private property housing market, which creates a divided society and undermines social democracy, because you end up with enough people with an interest in a speculative economy, just like the problem faced by New Labour. Yeah. In Sweden, you have a lot of institutional landlordism. Well, not landlordism because it's the state, but you have a lot of blocks of flats in urban areas which are rented out by the state to renters, which is quite good, he says, for social democratic class composition, but not universally popular because people don't always want to live in these big council blocks in the city, and it's sometimes seen as a bit imposing. In Norway, what they had was they encouraged nearly all families to own a property, But like many of the policy proposals in your report, they made sure that there was no possibility of a speculative economy arising in housing. I don't know if it has now, but he said that Norwegian option was the best for creating a social democratic population who are committed to the social democratic state.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because when you look around the world, you see kind of very wide variations in terms of the housing arrangements. But as I gave for the kind of Singapore example, and we can look at Germany and things like that, often you can have kind of collectivized forms of housing in what is still very capitalist economies, if you know what I mean. Austria is another one.
Which is what Adam Smith would have wanted, maybe.
What Adam Smith wanted, after all, maybe.
The real Adam Smith Institute.
Adam Smith, exactly, yeah. If only we could get the Adam Smith Institute to come on.
That's a good idea, actually. Yeah, we could have thrown Adam Smith at them. I'm sure they've sort of got an answer prepared for that kind of question. Right, let's do a couple more questions. I like this one. Anthony Sylvester question. There's about 26 Labour MPs who are landlords, including Thornbury Lammy. Should we implement a rule barring people who benefit from rentier capitalism from becoming MPs?
Do you mean as the Labour Party, should that be introduced?
Yeah, it probably can't be a law.
Yeah, so. I certainly wouldn't oppose that. I mean, a huge problem historically in Britain has been precisely that people represented in Parliament, and I don't just mean the House of Commons, I mean particularly the House of Lords, have been stuffed full of people who are, littered with landed interests, and so that has been a key barrier to reform in this whole area throughout history. And so the more that we can prevent having landlords or huge landowners or buy-to-let landlords in Parliament, the better, in my view.
All right, final question. Peter Smith, can an anti-rentier alliance of socialists and libertarians replace the old left-right political spectrum? So I suppose that's the idea of is it no longer capitalists and workers, but rentiers and renters that is the key cleavage dividing politics in Britain at the moment?
So this is a really good question, and I don't think that's an alliance that is worth pursuing, and I think maybe it's worth just focusing on this a little bit, because there is one of the important things that I personally want to get across with this report is land. If we want to understand the problems facing kind of British capitalism but other places as well, we have to absolutely be putting land at the centre of that, whether it's housing, inequality, financial instability, etc. But land does not solve everything, in my view, and there is a view, people out there sometimes called Georgists, after Henry George, who's a big kind of land value tax campaigner, who see just solving the land question is what all you need to do, and kind of that's the kind of magic bullet that will make capitalism a kind of fair and just system. That once you solve the land question, everything kind of ripples out and fixes itself. My own view is that I don't believe that. I think we need to be talking about capital as well and the other fundamental relations of capitalism. And so while I think it's important to be dealing with landlordism and rent extraction from the land economy, I don't think that we should be seeking to build alliances, or personally I wouldn't want to be seeking alliances with people who think that is all you need to do, and that once you do that, capitalism suddenly turns into this brilliant kind of fair and just system, because I don't think that's the case. I think maybe on key kind of campaign issues, I think there maybe is alliances to be built. I mean, one of the interesting things that's happened, of course, of the past year is the group Onwards. I don't know if you remember, I don't know if you know who they are. They're like a kind of new Tory kind of...
Oh, they're trying to revive Toryism for the young? From the bottom up?
Exactly. But they have been interested in... I mean, one of the proposals that we propose in the report, it's been talked about a bit, is reforming compulsory purchase laws and legislation, which is kind of a sensitive area because everyone freaks out when you talk about compulsory purchase. But it has actually got support from some people in the Tories, including Onwards, and there's been this kind of grassroots cross-party campaign that included people like Onwards, but also included people like Neff and Shelter and things like that, in order to try and bring this to the table. So on kind of single issue stuff, I think absolutely we should be building alliances where we can. But I would always be hesitant about saying, our interests are completely aligned with those who, the kind of free market libertarians who, yes, they might not want huge rent extraction from land, but they also want to completely dismantle the welfare state, privatise the NHS, liberalise everything else, if you know what I mean. To me, that's not the kind of people that we want to kind of build alliances with long term.
Very good answer. And you got the socialist and libertarian reference in the question that I didn't actually quite understand. So that's very good. Laurie McFarlane, thank you so much for joining me. I've learned a lot.
Thanks for having me.
For self-interested reasons, want quite a lot of these proposals to go through. That would make my life a lot easier, as I'm sure it would many of our viewers. I want to finish the show with a film by Simon Baker. Simon was the co-founder of EL4C, Ealing Labour for Corbyn, one of the best Corbynite accounts on Twitter, making genuinely inspiring videos over and over again. He also made some of the Labour Party's most powerful party political broadcasts. We're going to show one of those in a moment. Simon tragically passed away on Sunday evening. He'll be sorely missed. He was a key player in the Labour movement and provided so much, really. So may he rest in power. This is the party political broadcast he made last year called Our Town. This was Tysky Sour. We'll see you same time, same place next week.
These streets were once full of spirit and hope. A proud community where an honest day's work could earn you a decent day's pay. Years of austerity have ripped the heart out of this place. But that's just part of the story. This has been decades in the making. We lost the factories. We lost the jobs. We lost confidence in our community. We lost control. Once the backbone of this country, we've been sold short by a political and economic system that's been unchallenged for far too long. But change is coming. Labour has a plan to kickstart the economy in all the regions of our country, so that our economy works for everyone. Instead of standing idly by as jobs go overseas, we'll invest in the UK. They do it in other countries, and we'll do it here. Creating good jobs with decent wages, not short-term insecure work, but good jobs for the long term. And when more people are secure in their work, paid fairly and valued, they'll spend more of what they earn locally, and our communities will thrive again. But that's just the start. We want to restore the pride in our towns and bring our high streets and communities back to life. Labour will do that by getting the money to where it's needed, by setting up new regional investment banks whose priority won't be casino-style financial gambling, but investing in local people, local communities and local businesses. And with a national education service, Labour will invest in the next generation. Decent schools, well-paid teachers and smaller classes. We won't sell our kids short. We'll give them the support, the equipment and the confidence they need to flourish. We'll help those struggling to find a home by building 1 million affordable new homes over the next decade, not as investment opportunities for the few, but real homes for the many. We will give control back to local people. Labour will bring back essential services into public ownership. No more rip-off energy and water, expensive and overcrowded trains. We'll get them working in the interests of all of us. Together, we'll rebuild Britain. The time for tinkering at the edges is over. We need real and lasting change. It's going to take a lot of work, but only Labour has the ideas and the determination to take on the challenge. Labour will change our economy so that it works for everyone. Because when you create a fairer society, we all share in the wealth that's created.
Together, we will change this country for the better.
For the many, not the few.
For the many, not the few.
For the many, not the few.
Labour will rebuild Britain. For the many, not the few.